But that's basically the story of these, right? I mean, I can't give you, we don't want to have a whole course on how each of this happens in every place in the world, and happens in many places. But that's what I mean by history, is these kinds of engagements. They're claims of contract, and we'll see some examples of that in political theory. We talk about Locke, and we talk about particular revolts when particular contractual documents are written between the party of the sovereign and the party representing restraints on sovereignty. There are claims that in nature there are natural rights that you can't give up to a sovereign, like this, yourself. It'll be a defense against slavery. We'll talk about next time. So there are these Roman doctrines that says, look, sovereign is sovereign. You're just above it. That's the point. And then there's a tradition which says, actually not. Maybe God, it was a different story. But in real life, human sovereignty as it's instantiated in the world is restricted. And this we debate about. Then there's this doctrine here, which is sort of important, which is sort of a version of history. And this is a doctrine which exists, I think, in almost all monarchies, which is a version of the abiding will of the king. In the Chinese case, sort of the mandate of heaven. It's sort of some version of the abiding will of the king says, yes, the king can in principle do what he wants. And that his will is some version of law. It's absolute. But actually, there are two versions of the king's will. There's what the king says the day when he gets up from breakfast and says, I want to do X. Right? And there's the king's will when he actually thinks about it a little more deeply, which is his real will, which is his will which speaks to the benefit of his people as judged by some higher standard. Right? So that means the king is sort of bound by some version of a sense that he's not meant to exercise his will arbitrarily, but in accord to something. And when the king quits exercising his will according to something, the dynasty falls, or the king falls. Right? So there is, and in almost every political tradition, this notion that there is some version of a greater good embodied somewhere which restricts what the king does. Right? Doesn't even particular historical acts like the Magna Carta and its reissuing, but in a kind of sense of what constitutes this nation and its legitimacy. So, as I say, in the Chinese case, when a dynasty falls, it loses the mandate of heaven. It loses some sort of deep legitimacy. So that's what we mean by an abiding, there is abiding will of the king. And there's the third view in theology that God actually restrains the secular arms. There are sort of, if the king does something really bad, they can be struck down. And there are versions of this in the Old Testament, and there's political theory of this in the Middle Ages. I don't want to spend very much more time on this, but simply to say there's this long history coming together from lots of different places of these restrictions. Okay? Now, I want to end the lecture with two, I think, what might seem to you or strange examples, which is the examples of why do things that to us seem so self-evident not seem self-evident to people in the past? Well, this is the question of torture. Until the 18th century, almost all right-thinking people thought that torture was fine. Well, why was torture fine? Torture was fine because it was really important for the public to have a guilty person, somebody who knew to be guilty, to confess being guilty. It was important because the person who was guilty may have done this with someone else, and it's important to know who else they were doing it with. It's important because the person who does one bad thing probably did something else bad, and you want to know what the other bad thing is. And lastly, and this is kind of the most general version of this, it's because there's a sort of ritual cleansing function in torture. That is, you torture someone who is very bad by mutilating their body, by doing something to their body. You sort of you ritually cleanse the body politic of this evil, and strangely for us, you also cleanse the person of this evil. And by mortifying the flesh of the person, you cleanse him of the sin, and you cleanse the body politic of him. So for all these reasons, torture until the 18th century was thought to be fine. And I would want to suggest that especially the practical reasons were actually relatively little discussed in the period till the 18th century. But the last reason was really important, that this ritual cleansing. And also, part of that goes back to is the self-confession of guilt. You know, like we'd like someone in court right now to get up and say, "Yes, I'm sorry I did it." It's that sort of version, only you want to make them say they're really sorry they did it. I mean, you really want to you need to get this confession, even if you have lots of evidence that did it. So a great deal of early modern torture was not to get evidence. I mean, early modern, before the 18th century, not to get evidence, but to get someone to actually say that they were guilty. So that's the story of why torture seemed perfectly reasonable. So what makes torture, and there are lots of, I just showed this, I shouldn't probably be showing you this because this is one of these anti-clerical 19th century posters claiming the church was behind most torture, which they weren't. But this is how 19th century and late 18th century people who were against torture imagined it. They actually did see the church as an important villain in this because of this expiation of sin part. So you can I want to show you this, but just erase it and don't worry about it. Okay? This is how 19th century people imagined what was going on before. But what I want to show you here, which is an important 19th early image from the period. This is a martyrdom of a saint, but this way of executing someone, which is to draw and quarter them, is the common form of early modern execution of very bad criminals. So drawing and quartering meant that you drew them on a sled, and then you quartered them like this, and they don't show you this in graphic details, but you cut the joints so they'd actually come apart when the horses were pulling them, and the person was alive. And then you disemboweled them, and then you burned their bowels, to show that you really were getting at the heart of this problem. And then you'd burn the body, and then you'd scatter the ashes, and the person was really gone. So this was the common form of public execution for really bad criminals in the early modern period. That's to say before the 18th. And still went on in the early 18th century. In fact, the middle of the 18th century. Right? So in public. So no one's trying to hide this. Well, how does it become unacceptable? So this is sort of part of the story that it will become unacceptable officially in our Constitution against cruel and unusual punishment. Likewise in the French Constitution, the Belgian Constitution, the Italian Constitution, all the Western European and ultimately world constitutions are against torture in principle. So how does this happen? And I want to show you, I want to just give you these texts. The first paragraph I've already basically explained to you, but this is from a man named Cesar Beccaria. Can you see this up there? 1764. We'll resize the slide so it looks better on your. Let's see this. When you see this on BSpace, it won't be cut off. So it's 1764. Beccaria is really the father of modern criminology, and Beccaria is the sort of guy who basically applies what he says reason to this unreasonable idea of torture. And what he explains these reasons why he thinks. Well, I just told you why he thinks that torture is okay. And he then says, look, and then he goes through a whole bunch of reasons. Look, this is just irrational. It'd be superfluous to confirm these reflections by example of innocent persons who, from the agony of torture, confess themselves guilty. Innumerable instances may be found in all nations and in every age. How amazing that mankind has always neglected to draw the natural consequences. And so it's particularly stupid, and he gets to the next point, because it basically depends not on whether someone's innocent or guilty, but how strong they are. So the force of the muscles and the sensibility of the nerves of an innocent person being given, it's required to find the degree of pain necessary to make him confess himself guilty of a given crime. So the torture doesn't say anything about guilt or innocent. It just tells how strong you are. Weaker people more likely to confess. Dumb, irrational, doesn't get you anywhere. And he has other sort of things. He says, and you never actually find out very much under torture that you can rely upon because, again, people are going to say anything to avoid being tortured. So basically, he's the origins of this modern version. And the notion of self-incrimination is, of course, you're going to incriminate yourself if you're under this kind of pain, even if they know you're already guilty. It doesn't prove anything morally. And then there's the other notion that I talked about. There's another ridiculous motive, namely to purge a man from infamy. And I'll let you read this on the text, but more or less, here's the key line. More or less, infamy is a sentiment regulated neither by the laws nor by reason, but entirely by opinion. But torture renders the victim infamous and therefore cannot take infamy away. So, in other words, torture is the problem. It's not the solution. And the idea that you're going to torture someone and cause them pain and therefore remove some stain from the person or from the polity is just completely irrational and grows out of some strange connection of a particular religious version of scourging and getting rid of sin through the polity. So if you actually look at this juridically, it just doesn't make sense. So he's saying two things then. He's saying that it becomes unacceptable because it's not useful and it's not fair. That's one set of arguments against torture, which we still hear today. Why is it stupid to torture guys at Guantanamo or wherever, enhanced interrogation? Because it just doesn't work, number one. But the second thing it doesn't work is because it's sort of a new view of what's being human. A human is not a sin-bearing creature that we somehow have to deal with through manipulating their bodies in some particular way. Humans should be, as a consequence of there being no public purpose in mutilating, free of this kind of thing. So the anthropological foundations of torture in the old regime, the notion of a public expiation of a crime, of visiting a sin on the body in this ritualized way, is just not viable. And so that's the kind of argument he wants to make. And if you think about much torture in the modern world today, it's not actually torture to get information. It's torture to ritually humiliate someone. It's torture to make them negligible. It's torture to remove their humanity. It's torture to use just biological, to purge them in some way, to destroy them. And what he's saying, look, that's a primitive notion. He thinks it grows out of a religious notion. Leave that aside. But he says, look, there's an anthropological basis for torture, and it's just wrong. It's mixed up with superstition, with screwy religious beliefs. It's just wrong. So what Beccaria is saying, we get rid of the practical reasons for torture because they just aren't there. We look at it through the light of reason, and we get rid of the anthropological reasons by simply saying we don't live in a world in which we wish to expunge sin by destroying the body of a person. So those two things together then give a foundation for the almost universal rejection of torture in modern constitutions. Doesn't mean you get rid of torture, but you get a claim for torture. Okay? You see this argument I'm trying to make, how this builds up into what will become